What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Scouting the Fins right here on the Three Yards Per Carry podcast feed, also part of the Five Reasons Sports Network. The Miami Dolphins are 1-6, and this season was an absolute accident. Just like this Dolphin season, you need to be ready too. After an accident, your first move should be calling 305 800 pain. Better Business Bureau accredited with an A+ rating. Your car accident personal injury specialist. Fast connection with trusted doctors and attorneys. Always ready to take your call 24/7. Again, 305 800 pain. 305 800 pain. This show is also brought to you by ThompsonCigar.com. Use promo code 3yards20 for 20% off your order of $75 or more. Once again, this show is brought to you by ThompsonCigar.com. Use promo code 3yards20 for 20% off your order. Gentlemen, I am joined by Coach and Eric, my gracious to very handsome co-host.
Oh wow!
Uh, Last
That was quite an intro.
episode, we weren't as emotional compared to others, but man, I'm still not feeling good about this Dolphins team, even after the pressers, even after what Mike McDaniel is saying. His tone, his attitude, and his voice has changed a lot.
It's I don't want to say I feel better about the situation that they're in. It's just I feel like when something happens, you know, you have a you have a disaster, you go outside, you freak out a little bit. It's a disaster, right? But at some point the natural instinct goes, okay, well, all right, now it's time to take stock of the situation. It's time to start clearing some of the debris. Let's start making changes towards, okay, well, we know this happened. We can't just sit and stew in it and continue to, get ourselves upset and twist ourselves into knots over it. It's time to assess the situation and kind of move forward, turn the page, and go about the business of rebuilding, for lack of a better term. And also, ironically, what the Dolphins need to do, really.
Yeah, this collapse so far of the Dolphins feels so much deeper than the play on the field. It's structural, it's cultural, it's organizational, coach. All off season there was talk about changing the culture of the team, the organization getting much better, getting the right players in the locker room. None of that has amounted to be true so far.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. It seemed like in the off season, going through training camp, everybody is saying the right things. A lot of people were very pleased with the additions they made. I know that, I felt the roster may have been in a better place this year than it was last year when the season started. Obviously, there's been some injuries, but the big one, the quarterback, has not been injured, and we're still struggling. But here we are in week 7, heading into week 8, and the wheels have fallen off. Like Eric said, we had a little more time to kind of consume it before we talked on Sunday, but I don't know that my feelings are any different. I don't feel any better about the situation. I don't know that there's really any benefits to any rash decisions in terms of, you know, firing the coach, firing the GM right now. That could be debatable, I guess. But you do have to try to find some things to look at as the season goes on. Like if your stance as a fan is just to sit here and complain about every single thing that happens and the sky is falling completely, then it's going to make for a really long football season for you, and maybe you ought to find something else to do other than watch football. I know that for me and for us, that we're going to be looking for, none of us are going to expect this season to turn around. I think we're way beyond that point, but you can still look for stuff within the team, right? Even though we don't expect all of this, there's going to be a good chunk of this that does not return next year. So the rest of the season for us as fans and for the Dolphins should be about finding out what you have and what is worth continuing to go through. We saw that some this past week with guys like Ethan Bonner, Juju Brent starting to get a few snaps in there as well. Even the move of going to Dulcich coming up on the active roster with Waller going to IR, like it definitely a bit of a youth movement here for them to find out what they have, and I think that's what we're going to see as we move forward through the season.
Yeah, I think that you have to, in turn, find what you can salvage and move forward in the next future years. We're sitting here talking about, the Dolphins are 1-6. Maybe they go on a 6-7 game win streak. At this point, for us, I think our opinion is that it may be highly unlikely. I mean, they really could be the worst team in the NFL right now if it weren't for a strip by Jack Jones up against the New York Jets. Like they could be winless right now. It's all not just that, the sky is falling down. It's all not that just, there are some positives to this. This team is bad. The metrics say it. The narratives, obviously, we're talking about it, but even the coaching aspect, the organizational aspect, everything everything is just bad. You're talking about a roster full of players who are paid more than maybe 10-20% of the salary cap, and they aren't playing like they're worth the salary cap. Tua Tagovailoa specifically, we haven't seen the Zach Sealer we have in previous years. I don't know what's going on with Zach Sealer. Minka Fitzpatrick, prized free agent acquisition, in the middle of the offseason. He's been okay. We know he had that penalty that was called earlier on. I didn't agree with it, but it's there. It shows up in the stat sheet. And the other prize acquisition on offense was right guard James Daniels. He played 3 snaps and he was hurt. This organization has banked on guys who have been injured and paying them an absurd amount of money. You brought Darren Waller out of retirement to play with Frank Smith, who's the Dolphins offensive coordinator, and Waller has been the only one to say, I will only play with Frank Smith. Granted, he gave us that New York Jets game, but outside of that, nothing else has a mess, and he's now on IR. Tua Tagovailoa, we spent an entire season talking about should he be extended, should he play on the 5th-year option. I think it was more so the latter, and right now we all look completely wrong about it. The only people who have been worth it, you can say Devon Achane. You can talk about Jalen Waddle. Definitely Aaron Brewer. He's playing like potentially an all-pro. On the defense, Jalen Phillips, he's almost coming along. Kenneth Grant looked much better compared to the previous games when he played up against the Cleveland Browns. He's coming along a little bit nicely. But on the defense, we're not seeing a whole ton of former first-round pick Chop Robinson. I mean, what's going on with that? He's playing less than 30% of snaps. I want to see what Juju Brents looks like in the secondary. And Coach, you talked about it. I know CK's talked about it too. Ethan Bonner and Jack Jones are swapping roles and swapping plays in between drives. Bonner has looked pretty good by my standards, especially since he hasn't played a lot of snaps in the regular season. But man, this roster, if you take a look at this roster wholeheartedly, there's about 15 to 18 guys you can say that aren't value added contributors. And this is part of the problem with this Dolphins team and this organization, specifically how they built this roster with Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel at the helm.
Yeah, and it just goes, it just paints everything that happened in the past in the most recent offseason in a whole different light. I think we kind of looked at what happened with Chris Greer and said, well, he's being responsible this offseason. He's not signing the big contract and making the rash decision. But you realize that it was just the fact that he had painted himself into such a corner to where it was kind of all he could afford was to bring in Darren Waller and James Daniels and the players that he did who were or are at this point injured. And that's been a hallmark of Chris Greer's GM tenure is he's very willing to take the risk on a player that he sees as an A-level talent if he's able to get them at a B-level price because, well, you're getting it scratch and dent here a little bit. And these are the risks that you take when that's the approach that you have. He's said it time and again that there's 100% injury risk in football. And it feels a lot more like 110% when you're suiting up for the Miami Dolphins. I'll tell you that much. But to your point, Sam, this is a really bad team. There is no sugarcoating, I think, the situation in Miami here around the Dolphins. But what I just wanted to kind of get at there was, I think it just needs to be a difference in perspective of, we know the situation now. I think the focus needs to become where do they go from here rather than just focusing on the situation itself, which I think we can all agree is right now probably one of the 3 worst situations in all of football.
Yeah, can't disagree with that one either. My thing is, as much as I am not a huge Chris Greer fan, my thing is that when you look across this roster, sure, you can pick out those specific players that are playing well, whether it's Jalen Waddle, Devon Achane, Aaron Brewer, defensively, if you want to throw, I don't know who you throw in there defensively, to be honest. But there is no units as a whole that you could say are playing up to or better than expectations, right? Even the running backs, as well as Devon Achane is playing, you're not getting anything from, your number 2 and 3 there. Alec Ingold seems to have taken a step back. Offensive line wise, sure, Patrick Paul is, kind of up and down. He has some really good games and some okay games in Aaron Brewer, but outside of that, it's complete trash on the offensive line. So, to me, that goes back to coaching. Like at some point, these position coaches, these coordinators need to get these guys playing above their talent level, right? Like I don't think that anybody expected great things from the defense, but they're not even up to the expectation. And maybe the secondary is, right? Like the secondary we all thought was going to be a complete dumpster fire. And that's like one of the lesser issues on the team right now with, the way that guys like Douglas and Fitzpatrick, those guys are playing. But outside of that, like, so maybe you could say that the secondary is playing better than we expected, but that's, taking a awful position and saying that it's playing okay. And that's not a good enough thing to overshadow these other position groups that are not playing up to standard. We thought that we were going to get, the 3 edge rushers of Phillips, Chubb, Robinson, supposed to be nightmares for quarterbacks, and instead they're missing open opportunities at making plays, and that does fall on the players as well. Like Anthony Weaver has done a good job of putting them in position to make plays, but there's some sort of disconnect there at almost every position group as you're going through this. That none of these coaches are getting even the up to the talent level out of these players. So I don't know. I think there's just.
But what changed though, Coach, from a coaching perspective? There wasn't a whole lot of turnover on the offensive and defensive coaching staff. Sure, you added
No,
Bobby Slowick on offense. On defense, you had Matthew Arujo, their defensive backs coach, get a promotion as well. I don't think it's more so of a coaching issue or a coaching problem. I think it's more so the talent and the leaders that they lost last year were holding up and overplaying their end of the bargain, especially on offense. I mean, Teron Armstead, you can say he was playing hurt the entire year, but you cannot question that man's leadership and how he was able to at least get the offense functioning when he was there, even if Tua wasn't playing that well. For all the talk about Tyreek Hill not being a good teammate, we're seeing the result of his presence not being there on the offense. I mean, coach, you talked about it. He was leading the group, in that season opener huddle as well. He was getting those players hype. I haven't seen that from Tua. I haven't seen that from Jalen Waddle. I haven't seen that from Aaron Brewer at all on offense.
right. And I agree with that, but at the same time, you're talking about guys like Teron Armstead. I've seen I think it was Omar talking about the impact of losing Calais Campbell being able to call stuff out defensively. But if you're letting those leaders walk, right, then if you're letting those leaders walk and those units are kind of falling apart, doesn't at least part of that fall on the coaching staff for not being able to supplement that leadership? Like it feels like those players were in here and those players were kind of the coaches on the field type deal. So it just feels like I don't know. You do make a good point there with the leadership being lost, but I feel like that falls back on the coaching staff to be able to, promote guys from within basically and be able to keep it going.
So then, Eric, we see this as a result of McDaniel's quote unquote player led locker room where no one is stepping up. The coaches have taken a back seat and everything is falling apart. How do you change the culture of a player led locker room to the coaches buckling up their bootstraps and dropping their nuts on every single player?
So I don't. Number one, really odd analogy. Number two, I don't think you turn that ship around in midseason. I don't think you can. Any efforts to do so now would come across as disingenuous because the players know this coaching staff. They know Mike McDaniel. Mike McDaniel's not just going to become a different guy, start talking differently, and the players are going to take that well. It's just not going to happen. I do think now, though, when you look at the way things went down in the off season, and unfortunately, it becomes painted in a different light when you really think about in its totality. Teron Armstead's decision to retire, Calais Campbell walks, Jalen Ramsey has his schism with Mike McDaniel and is out the door. Deshaun Elliott and the things that he had to say on his way out. Jordan Poyer and the things that he had to say on his way out, even though he was awful himself last year. It just points to, how much of this is the Dolphins letting these guys walk versus how many of those guys knew what they were getting themselves out of with this locker room in this situation. Because it did feel very much at the end of last year like a broken kind of situation. And I think that the Dolphins just kind of went into things this year just hoping that time away would make it better. And that's really not a plan when it comes to addressing these things. If you want a player-led locker room, you need a coach that's going to empower his players. And that's an active role that a coach has to take. It's not a passive role that a coach has to take. Otherwise, you're passing the buck off to your players. And that's where I think you see the difference between, what I think Mike McDaniel had idealized in his mind for what the team would look like and what it actually is. Because it just feels like instead of, hey, I have this control, I can take this control, I'm going to give you some of that. It's like, hey, no, this responsibility, not my thing. You guys take it.
Yeah, he's putting the monkey on someone else's back. He's taking away from himself and putting it on to others. Although from the presser and a couple of comments from the players saying that they kind of like this version of Mike, like giving the hard talks now, like not taking any bullshit, excuse my language, from players. The fact that it's taken up until this moment uh, speaks a lot, and it's too little, too late. We talk about better late than never, but at this point, it might be too late. All right, before we head to our break, a message from our sponsor at Underdog. Football season is in full swing, and Underdog is the best place to get in all the action. Playing on Underdog is easy. Just pick whether your favorite players will go higher or lower on stats like rushing yards, receptions, touchdowns, and more. Get your picks right, and you can win up to 5,000 times your cash. That's right, 5,000 times your cash. This week on Underdog, I'm looking at the Thursday night game between Justin Herbert and Carson Wentz, and I am taking Justin Herbert. He looks like he's going to have 23 and a half right now on Underdog. It shows that he's got 23 and a half completions. I think I'm going to go a little bit higher on that for Justin Herbert on Underdog. Download the app today and sign up with promo code 3yards to score $100 in bonus funds or bonus entries when you play your first $5. That's promo code 3yards. Underdog. Make picks, win money. Once again, that's code 3yards on Underdog.
Be 18 plus, 19 plus in Alabama and Nebraska, 19 plus in Colorado for some games, 21 plus in Arizona, Massachusetts, and Virginia, and present in a state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. See assets.underdogfantasy.com/web/play and get terms _DFS_.html for details. Offer not valid in Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Concerned with your play? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit ncpgambling.org. In New York, call the 24/7 HOPE line at 1-8778-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369.
And we are back. All this talk about leadership and organization, there's also one more man we have to talk about. That's Dolphins owner Stephen Ross. This week, Barry Jackson of a Miami Herald dropped two pieces that go way beyond the football field. The first one is bluntly titled, he calls Stephen Ross a negligent custodian of the Dolphins franchise. Wow. Not mincing any words on there, Barry. Last week, Stephen Ross, who's 85, he spent the week expanding his real estate empire, acquiring the Ben Hotel and Clark Lake office building, while the Dolphins dropped to 1-6. Sounds like an owner who's not necessarily concerned with football, more so concerned with making much more money and expanding his business. 16 years of ownership, 0 playoff wins, and a 25-year playoff victory drought, the longest in the NFL. I'm 26 years old. Eric, you're also 26, right? Exactly. And a lot of the calls from Dolphins fans and columnists are telling Stephen Ross to sell the team, delegate, or finally act. I think he pretty much nailed it. Like, you can't run this Dolphins team like a real estate portfolio. It seems as if Stephen Ross has kind of enabled mediocrity, has still gotten a lot of money from his team, expanded the portfolio with Hard Rock Stadium, with F1, with tennis as well. And he's kept Chris Greer here a long time. Allowed Chris Greer to hire Brian Flores and Mike McDaniel and Joe Philbin and others, hiring a coach without experience leading grown men. Is the root cause Stephen Ross in all of this?
It's. I mean, depending on how far back on how zoomed out you want to pull it, sure. I tend to believe that unless your owner is Jerry Jones, there's really not too much of an effect that they have on the wins and losses on the field. Ultimately, he is the guy that's signing the paycheck, so that's got to count for something. In terms of hiring or promoting Chris Greer from the inside, I mean, I read something over the week about Chris Greer and the fact that he was the director of college scouting in the 3-year run where the Dolphins took John Beck, Chad Henne, and Pat White in the second round. And I'm just like, oh my, that's the guy that you promoted. And that's, I mean, that in and of itself, I don't know how even in that position he would have survived a 3-year run like that. It's tough to say because I know what really bad negligent ownership looks like in South Florida. I follow the Marlins. And it's tough because
poor thing.
On one hand, I look at Stephen Ross and I admire financially how much he's willing to put into it. It just feels like he is a very, very rich, very, very naive, well-meaning owner.
Way to put it nicely there, Eric.
Yeah, because I mean, he just seems like he's very easily convinced. When he hires a head coach, he becomes enthralled with the guy. Adam Gase was the best thing ever. Mike McDaniel was the best thing ever. Brian Flores was the best thing ever.
Joe Philbin was the best thing ever.
Well, yeah, even for a short time, him.
Yeah, but then you take a look at the other good coaches he's lost with those other coaches in his plan: Ben Johnson, Zach Taylor, Dan Campbell, Anthony Campanile. He's getting coaching looks, and maybe potentially Anthony Weaver too.
Maybe.
I just think that, I mean, I don't want Ross to meddle in day-to-day activities. We've seen the way that it looks for franchises where owners that aren't necessarily football guys try to stick their foot in there, and they have every right to do that if they want to. I think that you guys are right that he's a real estate guy that owns a football team, and I can't blame him for that. Hard to argue with a guy that's making millions and millions of dollars, right? He's going to make money on this team almost no matter what. And some people say that the only way that changes are going to be made is if he feels it in the bottom line, which is difficult to do because, most of the money from NFL teams come from the marketing deals and the TV contracts. So, we really don't have a huge impact in that sense. I do think that it would be more valuable to have an owner who was more present. I think that not necessarily pushing decisions or making decisions, but just having somebody that would be in the building more and just a little bit of accountability there, where it almost feels like he's, I don't want to say an absentee owner because he's obviously at games, he's around. But as you're going through the week, you're not seeing the owner around, and it's like, just kind of I hate to use the analogy, but letting the inmates run the asylum, right? They're just kind of there doing what they want from day to day. And there's not, doesn't feel like a lot of oversight there. And the guy that he entrusted with that control being Chris Greer, you guys just sat there and listed a bunch of the bad decisions, even just outside of the personnel that have been put on the field. There's been plenty of other questionable things that Chris Greer has had a very heavy hand, if not the biggest voice in the room on those things. And that whatever the next iteration of the Dolphins looks like, I don't see Stephen Ross suddenly becoming more involved. I don't see him saying, okay, I'm going to stop doing my real estate thing so I can go manage the Dolphins and put a winning product there. So I think that's going to be very key that whatever happens next with the Dolphins, that they find the right guy that's in the building every day that everybody is reporting up to, and make sure that that person is not only somebody that Stephen Ross can trust, but also somebody that is, going to do stuff with the organization's best interest in mind and, be competent at it as well.
Yeah, Barry laid out 3 options in his article. The first one would be selling to Ken Griffin. He reportedly offered a $10 billion for the team in stadium. Stephen Ross said no because there were like almost $1 billion in tax implications and estate planning. The second option was handing the operation to his daughters, Kim and Jennifer Ross, and his son-in-law, Daniel Silman, who is Kim Ross's husband. And the third option is, looking in the mirror, cleaning house, firing Greer, firing McDaniel, doing an entire reset of this team. But at 85 years old, do we really think Stephen Ross has it in him to go through another rebuild? Which goes to the second article by Barry, which could be the potential succession plan and the future of the family ownership within the Ross family. He talks about why the sale is unlikely, as I just pointed out, and legally and financially, it's in best position to keep this team into the family with Jennifer Ross or one of the Ross daughters as a designated successor. But Daniel Silman is most likely the key guy in this. And Chris Kaufman of 3 Yards Per Carry pretty much laid it out in our OnlyFins main Discord. He's the CEO of Relevant Sports. He's a respected sports executive, and he's expected to co-manage this in the future. With him being the CEO of Relevant Sports, him and Stephen Ross started up this company, and they formed it and managed it to bring all these sports properties such as I believe it's the Miami Open and F1 along with Hard Rock Stadium into Miami to increase their portfolio and increase this business. He's also apparently best friends with Maverick Carter. And quote unquote, Daniel Silman just gets it in terms of sports businesses and sports franchises. Eric, Coach, your thoughts on this potentially happening in the future?
Yeah, I feel like this isn't the first rumblings that I've heard of, Stephen Ross's daughters becoming a little bit more involved in the day-to-day operations of the team. I think that that's something that it's felt like maybe since the beginning of the season, we've kind of heard whispers that that was the direction this was going to go in. And as far as Daniel Silman goes, honestly speaking, I have no idea what he would bring as the owner. I can get quotes that he quote unquote.
Apparently, he's not going to be the owner,
or not.
Yeah.
Well, acting as somebody that has a vital say in the day-to-day runnings of the organization. It's one of those things where you never know until you see a guy in that spot, because you would have thought Michael Jordan being the greatest basketball player who's ever lived might make a decent owner as somebody who understands the sport and understands the game. Not the case. I can hear that a guy gets it, but until I see him in that, or until I see them making those decisions and hiring the right people, it's kind of, it's all theory. It's not there's no proof behind it. So I'm going to be skeptical of anyone that comes in. Not skeptical in the sense that I'm just not going to believe in anybody that comes in, but skeptical in the sense that, like with all things, I'm going to have to be shown that in that decision making capacity, you've got the goods. Because I mean, as an owner, there really isn't any, or as a chief executive of a football team, there's really no track record to point to for any of these guys like there are with front office people that get hired or coaches that get hired.
I think that the Daniel Silman thing would be kind of a best case scenario that we can hope for. There are plenty of people that would love to see Steve Ross just sell the team outright. But, like Hassan talked about there are financial implications that make that nearly impossible. And he's not going to change what he's doing to stop his real estate stuff and be in the building more. So, if the succession plan is the daughters, along with Daniel Silman, and Daniel is already, working those other lines of business with the F1 and the Open. That's all stuff that's there at Hard Rock Stadium, right? So, maybe even though Stephen Ross is still the owner, for as long as he's alive, maybe this is getting that guy in there that's at ground zero day to day, right? That everybody's seeing in that building. They know that, even though he's not the one cutting their checks, that's the executive that Stephen Ross has put in place in the building to make sure that things are, running as they need to. So I do hope that these rumblings of Daniel Silman as part of that, what'd you call it, executive, whatever, what'd you call it, Sam, the company that he's running?
Relevant Sports.
Yeah, with Relevant Sports, right? I hope that is, the Dolphins get kind of brought into that umbrella and he's overseeing all of it, being there and being that face in the building that everybody has to answer to.
You never know. If this does work, Daniel Silman could end up becoming like Stan Kroenke, who owns the Rams, the Nuggets, women's soccer teams. That's probably the best case scenario. Financially, Stephen Ross, keeping control of this team makes sense, but competitively for now, it's killing the Dolphins franchise. You've got billionaires planning succession like a family business, but no real football accountability. And that trickles down to the general manager, Chris Greer. That trickles down into several head coaches that have been here in his tenure, like Mike McDaniel, and even into the locker room with players such as Tua, players such as, who were here in Miami, like Jalen Ramsey and others. And it's all just trickling down into this team, and it's not a good look. And it's pretty much the beginning of the end where another rebuild is on the way. And it leads me to the big elephant in this room. The one word no one really wants to say out loud in this business is tanking. Are the Miami Dolphins quietly and actively tanking this season?
No. One of my least favorite things about sports discourse in general over the last 5 to 10 years is the concept of tanking has just removed the possibility of teams just organically being very bad. And I think exactly. I think that's kind of where we're at with the Dolphins. They were, they've spent a ton of money on this roster, spent a ton of draft capital on this roster. This was nowhere near what they expected this season to be. Things just kind of went left. And sometimes that's what happens in sports. This is not 2019. This is far different from that. This is just a team that pushed its chips in to the center of the table, and it just completely backfired on them. It's not tanking, but the results may not look all that different. This could be a 3 or 4 win team when everything's all said and done at the end of the year. But they will have gotten there on their own merits or lack thereof, not because of, we need a top 5 pick.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's any way that they came into this season expecting anything close to this, and this was viewed as a tank season. I don't think we're sitting here at this point in the season, and the GM or the head coach or any of the players on the field are saying, we're tanking it.
But
obviously everybody is
this
fighting
be a
for their
soft
jobs.
reset though? Could this be? And I'm sorry to interrupt, but coming into the season, we heard this year could have been a soft reset, at least financially, But you couldn't have expected that they would look as bad as this. Maybe this is still considered a soft reset, but some people may outlive all the bad in this.
Yeah, but a soft reset, I would use more of a life cycle of a roster type deal. Like you're even the best rosters, the dynasties, they're going to have points in their life cycle where they're spending more, where they're bringing in the big free agents to make that final push, and then you're going to have the years that are a little more lean in terms of what you spend in free agency, and then you're loading up on draft picks, and you're expecting those young guys to play well. So I don't think that um, a reset financially, I don't view that the same as a tank. I feel like it was trying to transition into the next phase. Not, when I think tank, I think, we're tearing it all down. We're trying to make it as bad as possible so that you can position yourself, for that top 5, top 3 type pick. Whereas, a reset or the roster life cycle, when you're in this part of it, it's you're trying to find ways to stay competitive through that. And I think that's what, even though we hadn't had the playoff success, I think they were still trying to kind of at least be in that same range where they were competing and playing in playoff games, and it's backfired completely. I don't think that anybody is sitting here saying, okay, let's fold it down, let's shoot for that number 1 pick or anything like that. But I do think that, like Eric said, you can just organically be bad, like not making any changes right now. If you are hoping for the Dolphins to tank, then not making any changes is probably the best way to do it based on the way that they're playing. You go and you fire McDaniel and you bring in a interim head coach, you're probably going to get a 4 or 5 game boost in terms of morale that could ruin the pick. So if tanking is what you are hoping for, I don't think that you're going to get the buy-in from anybody inside the building that that's what they're doing. But based on the way this team has performed so far, keeping things the same is going to be the best way to tank this season.
Well, we do remember the Dolphins trying to tank in 2019, and now we're at this point where they absolutely butchered the tank. And look, this is where we are now, 6 years later. An 85-year-old owner focused on real estate, a coach whose locker room has potentially tuned him out, a quarterback admitting he can't multitask this season, and a franchise that looks to have lost its soul. It might not be rock bottom, but it might be there. It really might be there, and it looks as if there's another rebuild on the way. All right, gentlemen, Eric and Coach, thank you guys for being amazing and, I gotta say, very handsome co-hosts on this show. And as always, y'all stick with us here on Scouting the Fins, part of the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast feed, also part of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. As always, go Fins.